Welcome. My name is Jerry Reinhardt. I'm the director of the C.W. Parker Carousel Museum in Leavenworth, Kansas, and I'm standing in Leavenworth, Kansas right now beside the Missouri River. And I'm out here for a reason, because this river is sort of important in our story. C.W. Parker came to Leavenworth in 1910 from Abilene, Kansas, where he grew up. He came here looking for better facilities to build a carousel factory. He came to Leavenworth because of the river, one, and because it had 5 railroads coming through town. He was looking for better transportation than Abilene, Kansas primarily. This museum behind me tells the story of C.W. Parker and his growth here in the city of Leavenworth. C.W. Parker was born on April the 26th, 1864. In the middle of the Civil War was still going on. He was born in Illinois on a farm just a few miles north of St. Louis, about 20-30 miles. And when he was 5 years old, his family picked up everything, loaded it into a farm wagon, and came across to free land that was being offered near Abilene, Kansas. And they made that transit with everything they owned in a farm wagon. And a farm wagon is not very wide. It's about as wide as an automobile, but about 10 feet long. And they probably pulled a milk cow and a crate of chickens with them. And that was it, and everything they owned in the back of that wagon. When they got to Abilene, he got some free land out east of town, and he tried his hand as a farmer and failed. He didn't do well. He was not a dry weather farmer or dry dirt farmer. So when C.W. Parker was about 15 years old, he'd completed 8th grade in school, his family left him alone in Abilene on his own to make his way. Well, it wasn't too long after that he discovered girls, and this is his wife. They started out together and started their family, and he got into the entertainment business. And here is an entire layout of an entertainment area he had in Abilene. And right behind this building, or this building, whichever one you want to look at, is the Eisenhower home, which is still standing there, that Mr. and Mrs. Eisenhower lived in, and Dwight was brought up in. And Mrs. Eisenhower did not care for the Parkers because they brought in all this riffraff, and that was in her backyard, and every time she looked out her kitchen window doing the dishes, she looked out upon the Parker Enterprises, which were probably not the most tidy things in the world at that point in time. Parker's first carousel that he ever saw was a track machine built by Armitage Herschel. The story is his daughter saw it when he took her down to show her daddy's enterprises, which was a shooting gallery and a high striker machine that he owned. And there was this wooden horse circling around in the middle of the road there, and his daughter supposedly spent the last dollar he had in his pocket, which was to buy that week's groceries. Can you imagine buying a week's groceries for $1? But that was it. That cost him a lot of money. But eventually he made money on it, because he recognized that machine that he spent $1 on for his daughter was a money-making device, and he immediately started making some to go along with his shooting gallery and his high striker. And this is one of the very earliest ones that Parker made, and it's off of a track machine, similar to what they have in Abilene today. They still have one of the earliest Parker machines there in Abilene. A little bit later, he developed this one, which is a little bit nicer looking horse, a little bit fancier. He's starting to get a little bit more artistic. Now, while Parker was in Abilene, he got interested in aviation. And he would put that one on each one of his carnival trains, and when he got to a new destination, he would inflate that bag and float out over whatever town it was and attract every kid and dog in the neighborhood and lead them to the carnival. So he was into aviation very, very early. It's a difficult thing to control, but that's the kind of thing they had during World War I. He also built old steam boilers to provide power in all these pastures where he would set up and because there was no electricity any place, mostly in the country, so he had to bring power with him when he went. Now, in 1903, while he was still in Abilene, the Wright brothers flew the airplane for the first time. And Parker's ears immediately went up. He went to full attention because he knew this was something new and going to be important to stay up with. So he put an order in with the Wright brothers for the first aircraft that they produced. And here it is. Right there is, and he said, if it flies, I will buy it for $5,000, and he did. So when he was planning to come to Leavenworth, and he was beginning to plan already because Abilene had some restrictions. It only had one railroad coming through town. He was having troubles with the city fathers on getting permits to do what he wanted to do, and he needed to expand badly, and they wouldn't give him the land to do it. So he started looking around for a new place to go, and he looked at several cities in the Midwest. The prime consideration at first was Omaha, but then he discovered Leavenworth. And he came to Leavenworth because Leavenworth had 5 railroads coming to town at that time, and it also had the Missouri River. And that was a main transportation way to get shipments to Europe. Just take them down the Missouri River and out to sea and load them up on a ship, and away they'd go. Now, when he moved to Leavenworth, he had a fairy tale idea that this was going to be what the Carousel Factory would look like, 6 stories tall. And if you'll notice right up there's an airplane. And it's that airplane that you just looked at over there. It's basically the Wright brothers aircraft. And he was going to produce that airplane on one floor of this factory building. He also bought 300 acres of land directly across the Missouri River, right opposite where our museum is today. There used to be a bridge going across, a pontoon bridge, and Parker was going to put on air shows at his aerodrome, and that was going to be a first. Nobody had done air shows yet. People didn't even know how to fly, and he's going to put on an air show. It's just that kind of fantastic thinking that fascinates me, how he could come up with an air show when people barely were getting off the ground. I don't know. But that was his plan, and he was going to take that airplane and copy it and make it right there here in Leavenworth. And you can see it doesn't even come close to that 6 stories he had over here. It's only a few stories tall, 2, matter of fact. But there were some interesting things about that building. All the power system was in a boiler room down here in this corner, and this area over here was where his office was, and he had taken all of the floors on the office area and shifted them up 1/2 a floor so that he could sit at his desk in the middle in this section and see on both floors what was going on visually out his window, so he could keep track of what's going on. So this guy's not too dumb. But he's also a little bit of a braggart because things didn't always turn out to be exactly the way he said. This is a poster he put out for the Abilene era. And you can see the buildings in the background that supposedly were the Parker factory. And you saw them over there on the other side, and they were a bunch of chicken coops and sheds and barns and things like that. And that's all there was. But it does show the way a carousel operated back then with the old steam boiler, and it had a couple of cables that came off of that. But this depiction is wrong because it's going to one point down here on the side of the carousel platform, and that wouldn't work. It has to go spread, and it went to hooks that were underneath the platform, and it had to go all the way around and come back. And this is another poster that was taken a little bit later in 1904, made a little later, of Parker's Carnival operating on the state capitol grounds in Topeka, Kansas. And as far as I know, that's the only time a carnival has ever operated on a state capitol grounds. But what I like about it is it shows most of what Parker produced. And the main thing I was going to show you is the sideshows. That was the primary moneymaker. People were sitting out in the country with no entertainment at all, and you would come to a flurry of sideshows, any one of which was more excitement than they had seen in 10 years. And they could, for a nickel or a dime, they could go in and see an equivalent of what was being shown on Broadway at that time. Here is a carousel down here in the corner. Back here is a swing set. And over there on the far side is a Ferris wheel. Only Parker called them Parker wheels. But I really wanted to show you the sideshows because that was the primary attraction of the carnivals back in that time frame. But he also had his equivalent of Evel Knievel. Evel was sitting here coming off the roof of the state capitol in Kansas on a bicycle and making a jump through space to land on this side to come down. Evel Knievel did that again, but 100 years later. But that was outdone by Molly the Daredevil, because she got up here and climbed into a ball and came down this chute, did a loop, and then flew through space and landed in a net. The ball opened up after doing 67 tumbles or rolls inside that thing, and Molly climbed out and stood up. But that's not even the best. There's a guy that got up on the roof up here and dove into this tank of water down here that's only looks like it's about 2 to maybe 3 feet deep. Now, I can understand the getting into the water, but what I can't understand is how he got all the way from this roof all the way out to where the tank is. I mean, there's something wrong here someplace. Parker also produced rail cars. He built rail cars just for carnivals. And one of the things he did when he built his rail cars, he put in steel reinforcing. And I guess back then they used to have a lot of train wrecks, and his steel reinforcing saved a lot of lives just because, well, those old wooden cars, they just used to turn into matchsticks. And Parker's favorite color was yellow, so his #1 show on of the 4 carnivals that he had was yellow. And that #1 show always had a preview show right here in Leavenworth every spring before they went out on the road, and people would come from miles around to see that extravaganza because it was something to see. Over here on the wall we have some printed posters that were part of a system whereby he had an advanced car that went ahead of his carnival trains with about half a dozen guys in it, and they had a printing press in there, and they would print up advertising material for this coming event that was going to arrive in a town within a week. And here are some of them, and talking about all kinds of the different things that they were going to exhibit. Usually when they would put these posters up, they'd give some kind of a free pass or free ticket to come in and see a show or whatever. It didn't cost him much, and all it did was the salary of these guys that went ahead of him a week doing the printing. Now, back in that time frame, we had blue laws. You could not make money on Sunday. Nobody worked on Sunday. Therefore, it was not legal to have a carnival operate on Sunday. So operating hours ran right up to midnight on Saturday night, and then bang, they shut it down, and everybody began packing up the carnival and loading it back on the train, and on Sunday they would be moving to the new town, wherever that was, 50 to 100 miles down the road. And they would set up again on Sunday, so on Monday morning they were ready to go. Sunday was you weren't supposed to make money, but it didn't say you couldn't work. So they did. That was the way the thing was set up. Well, this is our carousel room. In it we have 3 carousels that we show to the public. We only allow them to ride on one of them. Come on in. The first one you see with all the lights on it is our 1913 C.W. Parker carousel that was built right here in Leavenworth, Kansas, about a mile away over there at the factory building. It carries 24 horses, 2 rabbits, 3 ponies, a lubber's tub, and a chariot, a total of about 35 people. It's also one of the fastest carousels in the country. It turns at 5 RPM, and this carousel holds the world's record for the most number of riders in a 24-hour period of 16,480 riders in that time period. That record will never be broken because you can't run this carousel the way it was run at that time. During that period, when they ran that record, which was in central Iowa at a rodeo, they didn't have fences. And people could get on or off the carousel in any location they happened to be standing at as long as they had a ticket in their hand. But they didn't use that just exactly that way. They had 4 young men working on the boards that day. And when a person, usually a child, had finished the ride, they would pick them up off the carousel horse, and they'd be standing on the platform, and they'd dangle the kid over the side, get them running parallel to the boards, let go, grab another kid, and put them on the carousel. And that's why that record will stand forever, because you can't do that anymore. This particular carousel has 1 horse on it. When we stripped it down, we discovered it had a sign on the chest plate, made especially for Fred Shue, 1913, and Fred Shue was the first owner. Right in front of that horse is a pair of rabbits, which make this thing unique because Fred Shue saw these rabbits. The rabbits are actually 1914 prototypes for the new models of carousel horses that were coming out in the Parker factory the next year. But when Fred Shue saw them, he insisted that those 2 jackrabbits get on his carousel, so here they are. And they're the only jackrabbits, as far as we know, ever made in the Parker factories. They don't look too much like a jackrabbit. They look more like a bobtailed mule, but such as it is. This particular carousel is the number 118, and that's stamped right on that metal plate. Each of the Parker carousels has a bronze plate recording the numerical sequence of the carousels. This carousel has an electric motor now, but that electric motor used to be a gasoline engine when it was first purchased by Fred Shue. From that, it drives belts that go to a clutch, the clutch being there, and the clutch drives a drive gear which goes up with a drive shaft and actually makes the pin gear work, and the pin gear is what turns the overall upper mechanism. From the upper mechanism, it gets more complicated, but you've got a pole that goes all the way up with gears over it, and you've got a crankshaft such as this right here. And there will be 1 crankshaft for each pair of horses, and that crank goes up and down as it rotates, and this horse has a grasshopper gear, we call it, down here, rather than the telescoping gear which you'll find on some later Parker carousels. But the grasshopper gear gives you a very smooth ride. I like it better than the telescoping, I think. We also have this chariot on here, which we have modified somewhat so that it becomes wheelchair accessible. We got pins in it, we can slide it back and get a wheelchair up into this first section. And it doesn't get used very often, but at least it's there so that if somebody really wants to ride and needs to, and has to be in a wheelchair, they can get the ride. It also has 3 baby parkers. These baby parkers are for the kids. It's on a special crankshaft. The little kids, it gives them a very gentle ride up and back and forth, and these get used a lot. The carousel horses in 1913 all had real horse tails. I try to keep people from handling the tails, but you know how that goes. Tails disappear one hair at a time. They come back as souvenirs. We have also painted these horses. We're not sure what the original colors were. When we took them down, we stripped them. They were sort of ugly and they are all mixed up anyway. So what we did was pair them up and then paint them in colors. Every other pair of horses were white. And then we'd have pintos, and another white, and then a black, and then another white, and then so on all the way around the carousel. And it brightened the ride up quite a bit. The band organ that we have is a Artisan AX1, and it actually replaces what used to be live music played by 4 or 5 band members. Melissa Etheridge gave us the money to purchase this band organ. And Melissa has been down here with a couple, 3 times to listen to it and ride on the carousel. Melissa Etheridge is a Leavenworth resident, born and raised here. Standard signals on a carousel. 1 bell. Just stand by, we're getting ready to operate. Stay on your horse. Oops, I'm sorry, 2 bells. And then you pull on the clutch bar, and you do it gently, slowly in, and the carousel is going to start to move. As it gets up to speed, you can pull it into gear and let go of it and turn on the music. All carousels made in the United States rotate counterclockwise. So when you're standing outside watching your kids ride on that machine, you're looking at the right side of every carousel horse as it goes by. The right side is also called the romance side. That's the side where all the decorations are. If you look at the left side, which we'll go over there in a second or two, there's nothing. It's really plain. They didn't bother putting decorations on the left side at all. Notice the heads are always turned to the right. The mane falls to the right side of the neck. There is nothing over here on the left side. If there are any decorations at all, it's going to be on the right side only. The left side of the horse is very plain because nobody can see it, so they didn't waste the time on it. Parker horses are famous for their cantle carvings. The cantle is behind the saddle. This is the pommel of the saddle. This is the cantle. The cantle carvings on Parker horses are unique. This particular case, he's got a tobacco leaf. On that one over there, he's got an ear of corn. He usually just takes things locally. It might be a dog's head, it could be a cat, it could be a fish, or a flower, whatever he happened to have in mind, or the carver had in mind. And they always had hair tails up until 1914. They began to put on wooden tails because hair tails were getting a little expensive and they were running out of horses because those came from real horses. Now let's go around the other side and you can see just how plain they are. Almost no decorations at all. Very little mane on the left side because nobody could see it because there was another horse right here. Now when these horses were being transported en route, that's the crate that carousel you just saw out there that we were operating were loaded into when they were moved. 2 horses would sit on there side by side with the legs down in that cavity to protect them. Here is a picture of those 2 horses in that crate. It took 2 men to pick that up. You're talking about 150 to 175 pounds probably. And you have to take one at each end and lift it and carry it, and so you're talking about a lot of weight. And it was a struggle for some people, I'm sure. So eventually they got rid of these crates and they went to a bigger horse that was easier to carry, and they put something like this one over here. They went to a new design, a stretch design with the legs extended out, and 1 man could carry 1 horse in his arms. And that's how they were loaded. I got some carvings over here of all the different designs that Parker went through over the years in his horse styles. There is the very early Abilene style, the track machine that's set there, and notice it's a cute little horse with upright ears, and they're poked into a hole up there. And then he went to this sort of an ugly little horse. There's one of those still operating out near Seattle, Washington, and that's probably the ugliest horse he ever made, really. It's just pure ugly. And then he got a little bit cuter as he came back to Abilene, or got into the Abilene era. And that's not a bad looking horse. It's not too different from what we have here. And then down here you go to this is our 1913. And then right here, between that horse and that horse, is a switch from the 1913 to the 1914 style. And all the rest of the horses on this cabinet are 1914 style, and that's when he got flamboyant and went crazy with all kinds of decorations on his horses. And those are the horses he primarily is famous for making. Now, while we were all doing all this and scratching around trying to get this museum together, an NCA member named Charlie Walker, he didn't like to be called Charlie. He liked to be called Charles. I'll call him Charles. Charles Walker was one of our biggest helps. He gave us all kinds of stuff. He gave us all kinds of suggestions as we were trying to put this whole thing together. He knew carousels, he knew entertainment. That was what he did, and he lived in Atlanta, Georgia. And not too long after we got this museum going, he invited a pair of us to come down to Atlanta to his shop and pick up some Parker animal parts that he had collected and was in his warehouse, in his factory. So we went down, two of us, in a panel truck and loaded this pile of wooden carousel parts into the back of this truck and drove it back here to Kansas City and put it out on the floor of our workshop to see what we had. And we looked around in it and we said, hey, I think there's a horse in here. And what we did was discover this horse was in the parts laying there on the floor, and those parts were fresh made right out of the Parker factory, never used. And what we had was a animal Indian pony, really. And one of the mysteries of this horse is, what was this animal? Because if you look at the head, it doesn't look like anything. I've seen it, that horse or that skin, painted as a tiger. I've seen it painted as a bear. I've seen it painted as a cougar. But I couldn't figure out what kind of a cat animal was going to be on an Indian pony, so we made it a jaguar. And for those that don't know, a jaguar spot has a spot in the middle of it, which makes it a jaguar. So therefore, that's a jaguar skin. The face, I can't really tell you is a jaguar, but that's what we had to work with. But we put that together from parts out of the Carousel Factory and put it up, and it's one of our primary display pieces now. But the Indian pony was a very popular one that he did have all over for many, many years. And the rest of these, if you look down this line, they're all stretch necks, but every one of them is different. And they each had a different look, a different size. We discovered, as we learned, they basically built the same horse, they just made it bigger, as if they got a bigger carousel. If it went from a 2-row to a 3-row, the outside row was the same horse, but just expanded. It's bigger. This one is in park paint. It's what would the park paint is paint that would be put on by the carnival operator or the park operator. And it's not the best paint job in the world, but what it does is preserve the horse. This one's in pretty good shape. It's got a dog's head behind the saddle, and that was another common thing that he put on his horses. And it's sort of a nice looking horse, even though the paint job is not perfect. And then this one, somebody had a lot of fun dolling that thing up. It's got all kinds of imprints on it, stuff that's been stuck on it. This is not Parker decorations, but this is the way somebody decorated it to put in their living room, I guess. Now behind you is another horse that came out of the Parker factory. But this was a horse. Parker got involved in doing the carousel figure down in southeast Colorado. And I can't think of the name of it. I'll try to come up with it and go back. But he did pretty good on it, except he didn't have the big outside figures that they needed for that particular carousel. And in came a carousel in trade from Stein & Goldstein. And he took the outside row horses off of that carousel and put it on this carousel to go to Colorado. And I think this was one of those off of that same machine. Because notice that big head, that's a Stein & Goldstein head. But it does, the body, that's Parker. So there's a mixture in there. He either was looking at it and we don't know. We got it this way. We haven't torn into it to see what's new and what's old. But it's got the gun on the side. It's called Hunter's Pride. But look at that ear of corn. Isn't that gorgeous? And then these horses in the middle of the carpet here are all horses we have restored here in the museum. And this one I call the lead horse because it's got all the characteristics of a lead horse. It's got the jewels, it's got the American flag, it's got an ear of corn, and it's got a fancy mane. And it's a fairly big horse. It's a lead horse on a 2-row carousel, perhaps. The next horse back here is a fish horse, I call it, because of all the fish detail behind the saddle, hanging on the side, and it's got a sea dragon here on the shoulder, and it looks a little bit fishy, you might say. We have seen this carving. In this case, it's a sea dragon. On a horse back there, I can show you later, it looks like a wolf, but it's the same cotton picking carving. Now over here we have one of his more famous horses. If you get around over there, this is American Beauty Rose, and it's covered with flowers. It's got 2 roses behind the saddle. This is the most feminine of the horses that he put on his machines, and usually this was on the opposite side of Lilybell, which was the big main horse on a Parker carousel. Now, I don't have a real Parker Lilybell. What I have, well, I do, but it's not very good looking. This is the only Lilybell we have, which is a burned version right here that was on a carousel someplace, and it was charred, but you can see it was Lilybell. There's the mane, and it's got the decorations on the side that Lilybell is. But we also got 2 bodies, 1, 2, that came out of the factory unfinished, and those are Lilybell bodies. They've got the bunch of grapes on the hip. It's got the leaf, the triangular design on the side, and ear of corn are usually behind the saddle. And our idea is, since I can't get anybody to donate a Lilybell to me, we might make one out of one of these bodies. But you can see some of the Lilybell manes, and they were just absolutely gorgeous. That was his most famous, well-known horse. Now this one you're looking at right now, that is a metal one out of aluminum. And unfortunately, when you went from wood to aluminum, you lost an awful lot of detail. I mean, every one of them looked just like every other one, and that's really the sad part about it. The aluminum horses, the only thing you could change was the paint color. But they were cheaper to make, and he produced a lot of them. Now I'm going to try to show you how you make a wooden horse. These bodies, you have 3 bodies that came out of the Parker factory that were never finished. This is a hollow box as it's constructed with 4 sides and 2 ends, blocks in the end, and it's got what you call a mouse hole. Can you get your camera down here? Right underneath this, about 3 inches behind the pole, is what we call a mouse hole. And every wooden horse in this museum has a mouse hole. And we call it a mouse hole because when we restored that 1913 machine out there, when we opened the carousel up, that inside of that body was full of all kinds of nesting material, feed. We found all kinds of beans that had been stored in there. The mice had been using that mouse hole in all of those horses. It wasn't just one. It was all of them. And that's what they were living in, and they were traveling on the carnival in that carousel. And I can just imagine somebody sitting on that horse when that mouse crawled out, but I don't think it ever did because I never heard anything about that. We didn't discover it really until we opened those things up and found this nesting material, and we also found a couple of petrified mice that had died in there. So that's why we call it a mouse hole. But it has the purpose of creating a vent hole up into that body cavity. So when you build a carousel horse, the first thing you take after you build the body block is a neck block, and it's hollow. And it's got a hole all the way through. And you drill a hole here in the body block, and you put the neck block in place. And the next thing you do is put on the head block. And the head block is also made out of 3 pieces of wood. And it's got a hole that goes all the way up to about here. And you match this hole with this hole, and you put it together like that. And now you're getting what sort of looks like a carousel horse. give or take a little bit. Let me put this back because I haven't got enough hands. And then you have the leg block. The leg block is also made out of multiple pieces of wood, but what I really wanted to show you was this horseshoe that's on the base of every carousel horse made in Leavenworth, Kansas, and on it says C.W. Parker, Leavenworth, Kansas. And that goes under here and is held in place with glue and nails. And the glue they used was hide glue. And the nails they used were number 16 finish nails, and that is our problem. Every time we restore a horse, we have to pull those nails out because they cause wood rot. All around that metal nail that's driven into the wood, you'll see bad wood that's starting to rot, and it attracts moisture. So that's what we have to get rid of, and we replace those nails with wooden dowels. Drill them in and make them sure they're tight.
Where did this one come from?
This is right here from Leavenworth. It was made by Paul Parker. So it was C.W. Parker's son who took over the business in 1932 when C.W. Parker died. These horses are all aluminum, and they're all made out of the same mold. All the outside horses look alike, and all the inside horses look alike. The only difference is they're painted different colors. Now behind you is the same horse we have on this machine, only unpainted, that gray one. And these molds that were used to make these horses were used for years after this carousel was made. But this was the first carousel that we got up and running, and we used to take this out on the road just like a real carnival. We had to buy a truck to haul it, and we had to have a big crew to set it up and take it down and operate it. But that's with a big crew. We'd take 10, 15 guys down there. And the worst thing is putting that tent top up on a hot summer's day. When you get up inside this thing and are pulling that tent top up, man, that is work, and it's hot, and it's sweaty, and you don't come down smelling too good. Okay, let's see if I can get it going. I haven't run it for a while. It's noisy, and it doesn't have a band organ. This one, as you'll notice, has a different pin system underneath. The other one had a grasshopper gear. This has got the pin in the pole bit, and that pin is what all that noise you heard because it was sticking, and then it drops back down and makes a clunk when it hits the floorboard again. It normally does not do that quite as loud when you get it out and you get it exercised and the grease gets warm and stuff like that. And it rides fairly smooth, but it's just noisy. We have several exhibits around the outside wall here of various American carousel carvers. And there's always an argument as to who was the best or who was the father of the American carousel. And the argument seems to be between Gustav Denzel and Charles Dare. We don't have very much information on Dare, and we have quite a bit more on Gustav Denzel. He came to this country when he was 17 years old and went to work in a furniture factory as a wood carver from Germany. He came from Germany. His father had been a wood carver in Germany itself, and he settled in Philadelphia. His carvings became better and better in the furniture factory, but also on the side, on the evenings and on Sunday, he carved another carousel, and there we believe is the one he carved That's his first one. As you can see the detail that's in it and all the different animals that are on that. And can you imagine carving that in your spare time while you're still got a full-time job carving for somebody else? Notice also that all of those animals in that picture are standing on the platform. They had not invented the jumping mechanism yet, so all those carousels had was the beauty of the carving itself and the look of motion, while there wasn't any really other than the carousel going around in a circle. But notice all the different animals on there. You'll see lions and tigers and giraffes and goats, and about everything else you can think of is in there someplace. There was also another bunch of carousel carvers in Philadelphia. Daniel Muller came to work for Gustav Denzel. He worked for him for quite a while, and then he and his brother Alfred started their own factory there in Philadelphia, and many people feel that Daniel Muller was the premier carver. Of all the carvers that came to the United States, he was probably the best. And depending on what you're judging on, his horses were the most authentic, I believe, of anybody. We have a horse here. It's a E-Joy Morris. This carousel figure was on a carousel in Topeka, Kansas, until they took it down and we ended up with it eventually. It's one of my favorite ones because it's got a mistake in it, and I love finding mistakes in other people's carvings. But this one has a strap coming down on the right side that goes underneath and never comes up on the other side. So that harness the harness strap just sort of ends in the middle of the belly, and when we painted, we had to just stop. There was another carver in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Toboggan Company, and they started out doing toboggans, which are really roller coasters, but the toboggan was the name of the day. And they discovered there was money in carousels, so they began to build carousels. And this is one of the carousel figures that they produced, and they produced all kinds of them. They're one of my favorite carvers as far as beautiful carousel figures, because they're flamboyant, they're wild. You almost see anything. But one of the things I was going to point out was any of the carousel horses carved in Philadelphia, none of them have any jewels on them. The beauty in them is only in the carving itself. There were no jewels ever put on a Philadelphia carved carousel horse. But the guy that eventually put jewels on carousels was a guy named Charles Loof. And there's old Charles Loof with his beard, and he was a funny-looking mustache guy. But he carved some beautiful horses also up in the Coney Island area. And he was famous for bringing carvers from Europe over here and giving them the freedom to carve the way they wanted to carve. When you went through a German carving school, you were told, this is the way you carve. And this is the way that you had to carve, and there was no deviations from that. But when Loof brought those carvers here, he gave them the freedom to carve the way they wanted to carve. And all at once, they began to turn their talents loose, and they became some of the best wood carvers in the world as far as making carousel figures. And I think we've got far more prettier, more beautiful carousel figures on our carousels than any other country, just because of that. Also, he was the one that allowed them to put jewels on carousels. So you'll find jewels on Coney Island type horses, but not from Philadelphia. There's Stein and Goldstein. They were two of the smallest carvers we had in our collection of carousel wood carvers in the United States, but they carved some of the biggest horses. And I don't have a Stein and Goldstein in here, but they carved big figures to put on their machines. There's a model of one, but it doesn't count. And Charles Carmel was one of my favorite carvers because he was a hard luck carver. Boy, his story is terrible. He tried to break away from Loof. I mean, he got away from Loof, started his own factory. He produced his first carousel in his own factory. The factory caught on fire, it burned to the ground, and took the first carousel with it. And Charles Carmel went bankrupt, and he had to go back and do individual horses for people that needed a replacement carving on their carousel. And he would do that. He could carve and produce in a very short period of time a carving, and he would only charge $35 for that horse. And that horse today would be worth a minimum of $35,000 if you ever found a Charles Carmel horse. He was good. He was a good carver. Oh, the pig. Well, we also in this room we have all kinds of oddball examples of carousel art of sorts. This pig came from France, obviously, but it was in the Maritime Museum in San Francisco for years as a display on how you transported pork across the ocean on a sailing ship. And they put this pig in a cage as if it was a live pig waiting to be butchered someplace halfway across the ocean. And they finally decided that a pig with a blanket and a bow around his neck just didn't look appropriate to be a dinner. And they donated it to us. And we opened it up and took it apart and did it. And it was full of bugs. When we opened that rascal up, we were running for the raid because, man, it was bugs going every direction. And we finally got all those, but it's got some interesting character. First off, it carries two people. It's got a cast iron corkscrew tail. It's got a handle up here for two people or the front person to hang on. And it's a pretty good sized pig. The French like pigs. If you've ever been to Paris and you go to any of the gift shops, the gift shops seem to be full of pigs for some reason. I'm not sure what the attraction is, but around the corner here, we have a Parker Racing Derby under assembly. Here it's being tested out behind the Parker factory here in Leavenworth, and it's being pulled or towed by a Model T truck, and that's one section of the Racing Derby. And here's another view of it, and here is C.W. Parker sitting on it. His son Paul is back here in the corner, but you can see the mechanism underneath it here. And as it rolls around in a circle, these horses move in this track back and forth. So they appear to be racing with each other. And one might be up in front for a few moments, and then it would slide back, and somebody else would get up in front, and it'd go back and forth like that, and you whoop and you holler and you can kick and yell and scream. It doesn't do a bit of good because it's all handled mechanically underneath. And when the ride ends, and the ride stops, whoever is in front gets a free ride to go again. The other three have to buy another ticket. So he's making money. This guy knows how to make money. This was one of the biggest machines he ever built. It went across the river on the Kansas City, Missouri side, and it operated over there for a couple of years, and then it got struck by lightning and it burned to the ground, and he never made another one. It was difficult to move. You did not move it. It was just too big. But it was quite an accomplishment. It was a big machine. This is the only picture I have or I've found of the carving shop. This is on the second floor of this building. Up here you can see the windows and you can see all the parts of horses and carousels and everything else that's in there. And here is a construction line going down where they produced all of these wooden pieces that would go into a Parker carousel. This is one of Parker's prime carousels, and that's inside the Parker factory where it was constructed. Notice there's plenty of room. It's got all kinds of room, but I also wanted to point out, look what's back here. You see that? That's a slipper slide that comes down from the second floor. And some kid had the job of taking a finished part from the upstairs where it was carved and sitting on a gunny sack and sliding down that chute to deliver it to one of 4 carousels that were being constructed on that main floor. On the main floor also there was a railroad track that came in from the north end where they could push a flat car in, and they would load that finished carousel on that flat car to go to whatever its destination was or wherever it had been sold to. So that was part of the construction. They could assemble 4 at one time. There were 4 holes in the ceiling where they could hold the center pole up with a winch to construct it or to build it. And I don't know how many they produced in a week, but I'm sure sometimes it was almost one for each one of those holes. And over here in this corner, that's Parker's experiment before he got into aluminum. Before aluminum was even existed, he was trying to cast carousel figures out of cast iron. And if you want to try to pick up something heavy, pick up a half of a head and try to go run with it or something. You're not going to go very far. And I've seen one cast iron carousel. It was a Parker, and it was in a dentist's office in Atlanta, Georgia, when we had our convention down there. And I tried to pick up one horse, just lift it to get the weight off of the frame. And boy, that sucker was heavy. I mean, it was one heavy horse. And that piece right there is also very, very heavy. And that's only half of a head. So, but that was how they started. They tried cast iron. Obviously, it was not satisfactory. And when aluminum was invented during World War I, they actually invented aluminum to make engine blocks in the first aircraft fighters they had during World War I. And after the war, Parker took advantage of what they discovered during that war and began to use aluminum blocks melted down to make the molds for his carousel figures. And everybody else just followed suit. That was the end of the wooden horse era. Now we're looking at what we call our primitive carousel. It's the only carousel owned by the National Carousel Association. They bought it to save it because it was on its way to be broken up and sold off piecemeal so people could have one of these horses sitting in front of their fireplace someplace as an antique. It's primitive. We believe it was made sometime back around the Civil War. I believe it probably also was made in the vicinity of Baltimore because the center pole is shaped like a ship's mast with bevels on it so that it fits in this gear, and when you hand crank it, that turns the entire mechanism. The horses do not go up and down, but they do fly out, and that's why we call it the flying horses. There is a hook down here where you can detach the horses, and if you crank this fast enough, they will swivel and fly out into space. We have never done that. We've never had the room to let them fly out, and I think I'd be a little bit scared anyway to do it because they might just keep on flying. Let me turn this thing a little bit. These are hand cranked by 2 men, and they were pretty good sized men, I would suspect. But as I turn this crank, and it turns fairly easily with no load on. The horses themselves are pretty rustic. The body is made out of a solid log. Much of the neck and the head is solid log that's been drilled out and pinned together. The legs are cut out from some board and then attached. They have a real mane and a real horsetail, but the eyes are out of rivets. and much of the metal on it is hand forged. Each one is made, there's a body block, there's this little block of wood behind the cantle saddle, there's a neck block, a head block right here, and 4 legs. That's what each one of them has. And then they got a slit cut down the back of the neck with a part of a real horse mane and tail attached. Many of them were painted dapple, and the others were black. We have not attempted to color them in any way. That's the way we got them, and we haven't touched them. We've done as little as possible, but to make it operable so we can show what it did and how it worked. We think the center pole was from a ship's mast. It's got beveling on it. This was one of the things that almost caused us to give up on the project, but when we got it back, when we had it in our shop and began looking at it, we discovered it had cracks in it. And I could stick my fingers about halfway into this thing and wiggle my fingers around, and there was nothing in there. It was all wood rot. And we didn't know what the heck to do with that, so somebody suggested we try marine epoxy. So we bought some of that. It was very, very expensive, I thought. It was about $100 a gallon. We mixed up this epoxy and poured it into cracks that were in here, and the first thing that happened is it went right into that crack and right out on my shoe, which was underneath it. So we had to tape it on the bottom to seal it up and then fill it again and then sand it and sand it and sand it. But I think we have a solid epoxy center pole with a wood sheath around it, and that's about all there is to it. This table, we believe, is for a monkey organ. So for a third member of this family that probably owned this thing, to put a monkey organ on, to have a kid in there cranking it to provide some music while this was in operation. But it's quite a machine, and the National Carousel Association should be proud of themselves for having saved it, and it's here for the rest of its life if they want to keep it here. But it's display only. We never let anybody ride it. It's just too fragile.